White opens with one of the strongest possible first moves. The d-pawn occupies an important square in the center and attacks two valuable points, e5 and c5. Control of these squares keeps the opponent from making use of them for his pieces. The queen and dark-squared bishop can now leave the first rank. The king is safe from some of the surprise attacks that occur in king's pawn openings. These come about when black develops his f8, bishop at c5 and sacrifices it for white's f2 pawn to force the king out into the open and subject him to assault by the other pieces. Black equalizes the pressure in the center, prevents white from continuing with e4, and also releases two of his own pieces for action. This is a threat and an offer. The threat, a positional one, is c takes d5, when after the recapture queen takes d5, knight c3 drives the queen off and leaves white dominating the center. The offer of a pawn has as its purpose the removal of black's d-pawn from its fine position in the center. This offer, unlike the one in the king's gambit, involves no risk. White regains the pawn easily and retains an advantage. It is in effect an exchange of a flank pawn for black's center pawn. The point of playing c4 so soon is that it disputes the center at once, without endangering the safety of the king. There is also another purpose, a strategic one. An exchange of pawns must come, sooner or later, resulting in the opening of the c-file. Ownership of this file is of paramount importance in the queen's gambit. White generally tries to get full possession of it by posting his queen at c2, and developing his queen's rook at c1. Control of this file and of the c5 square on this file is equivalent to control of the game. Of such peculiar significance is this c5 square that it is almost enough simply to plant a piece securely there to get a paralyzing grip on black's game. Black defends the center pawn by supporting it with another pawn. He does not care to capture by d takes c4 as that means surrendering the center to gain a pawn which he cannot hold on to. White, in reply to this, would play knight f3, to prevent e5, follow up with e3, and then get the pawn back by bishop takes c4, with a central superiority. Defending the d-pawn by knight f6 is weak. White would play in response c takes d5, and black would have to recapture with a piece. On queen takes d5, knight c3 banishes the queen from the center and costs black time, while knight takes d5 lets white seize the center with e4 and evict the knight in the process. After the actual move, black is set to meet c takes d5 by e takes d5, keeping his hold on the center by maintaining a pawn there. This is a commendable developing move, as it settles a minor piece on its most suitable square without loss of time. The knight bears down on the e4 square and adds its pressure to that of the c-pawn in the attack on d5. This knight carries out his part of black's opening strategy by simply leaving the back rank. Naturally, his development is toward the center, where he counteracts the influence of white's knight on two of the important squares there. A highly efficient move as it combines rapid development of a piece with a threat. This latter consists of c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes f6, g takes f6 and black's kingside pawn position is shattered. Or queen takes f6, knight takes d5, and white wins a pawn. The opening thus far had been given sporadic earlier trials by various players, but Pillsbury was the first to appreciate its enormous winning possibilities. He pictured the bishop move. Most masters brought the bishop quietly into the game at f4, as a sort of Ruy Lopez on the other side of the board. With this particular sequence of moves, which he perfected and popularized, he achieved some remarkable victories, notably in his debut at the Hastings 1895 tournament. In this game, we see him applying the great power of the queen's gambit to crush an opponent who is not familiar with its fine points and who puts up less than flawless defense. He beats Mason like a child, as Marshall used to express it. If nothing else, the development of the bishop anywhere furthers black's progress, as the decks are cleared for kingside castling. At e7, the bishop is happily placed for defense, and, if the need arises, can be transferred quickly to a more aggressive position. Incidentally, the knight is unpinned and white's threat nullified. In queen's pawn openings, the king's knight's job is the control and sometimes the occupation of the outpost e5. In fact, entrenching the knight at this square and supporting it solidly with the d-pawn and the f-pawn is the motif of what later came to be known as the Pillsbury attack, a tremendously effective assault on the kingside. At first glance, this seems to be a simple and natural way to develop the c8 bishop, as it is hemmed in on the other side by the e-pawn. It took many years, and a great many losses by black, to discover that an early fianchetto of the bishop was not an easy solution to the problem of the bishop's development. After a great deal of trial and error, a reasonable defense was hit upon, which consisted of playing d takes c4 at an early stage, followed after suitable preparation by an attack on white's d-pawn by c5 or e5. The first of these moves, c5, is intended to dispute control of the center, open the c-file for the use of black's pieces and in general free his cramped position. The attack by e5 is meant to take away the control of e5 from white's d-pawn, and to open a diagonal for black's c8 bishop. In short, black first puts up a fight for the center before he thinks of developing the bishop. It is of almost vital importance that black play c5 sooner or later. This move strikes at white's d-pawn, establishes tension in the center, opens the c-file for his own major pieces and frees the crowded position on the queenside. Failure to make this move permits white to seize control of the c-file and the c5 square. Should white manage to post a piece on that square, it will exert terrific pressure on black's entire position, and this one factor alone may be enough to cause black's downfall. White strengthens his center and clears a path for his f1 bishop. Black completes the fianchetto development of the c8 bishop. The rook hurries over to the important c-file. This is only partly open now, but an exchange of pawns will clear the file and accentuate the rook's power along its whole length. Black usually waits until white moves his f1 bishop before making this capture, as then the bishop loses a move in recapturing. Apparently black is anxious to give his b7 bishop more scope on the long central diagonal. White recaptures the pawn and gets another piece into play. This disposition of the knight is characteristic in queen's pawn openings. The knight must not go to c6, blocking the c-pawn. The pawn must be free to advance and challenge the center. At d7, the knight is situated ideally. It supports an advance by c5 or e5, attacking the center, it participates in the fight for possession of these squares, and it cooperates with the knight on f6. The king disappears from the scene while the rook is made available for duty. The advantage of castling is that the king is safer in the corner, where he is sheltered by 3 pawns and a stalwart knight, than in the center of the board, while the rook is brought toward the center files in the most convenient way possible. The two most effective squares that white's queen can occupy in this opening are e2 and c2. At c2, the queen supplements the rook's action in exploiting the c-file, while in another direction guards the strategically important e4 square from invasion by black's f6 knight. At e2, the queen prevents black from breaking up the kingside pawn position by bishop takes f3, supports an advance of the e-pawn which would monopolize the center, and clears the way for the f1 rook to reach d1. Developing the queen to e2 offers another advantage, attack on the queenside. By playing bishop a6, white can force an exchange of bishops and then bring pressure to bear on black's light squares, weakened by the removal of the bishop controlling those squares. Black's purpose in this is to free his cramped position by bringing about an exchange or two. White is willing to simplify by clearing away some pieces, as he can then return to his theme of exerting painful pressure on the c-file. The alternative, retreat by bishop f4, offers Black a choice of too many good continuations. He could play knight takes f4, leaving himself with the two bishops, e takes f4, knight f6 followed by knight d5, keeping a piece permanently on a square where no enemy pawns could dislodge it. Or Black might attack the center at once with c5. Finally, he could swing the d7 knight over to f6 with a respectable game. White's actual move has the merit of restricting Black's choice of reply. This is preferable to capturing by knight takes e7 as Black gets his queen into play and unites his rooks. Naturally, he cannot go in for knight takes c3, bishop takes d8, knight takes e2, bishop takes e2, rook f takes d8, rook takes c7, triumph of the rook on the open file, as it loses a pawn in the game. This time the knight exchange suits White, who now can dictate the course of events. Forced, as bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, rook takes c7 costs a pawn. In forcing Black to take with the pawn, White has compelled the closing of the long diagonal, so that Black's bishop is now terribly limited in scope. Presto! The file is suddenly open, and the c-file action begins with the rook's attack on the c7 pawn. Black guards the pawn and prepares to dislodge White's bishop by c6. It is already too late to advance the pawn to c5 as after c5, seemingly a safe move as the pawn is triply defended and only twice attacked, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, note how White disposes of two of the defenders with one stroke, d takes c5, b takes c5, rook takes c5. White wins a pawn. White makes room for the other rook at c1, to add to the pressure. The device of doubling rooks on an open file more than doubles their strength on that file. Black tries to evict the annoying bishop. This is much stronger than bishop a4, when Black gets some troublesome counterplay by b5, bishop b3, a5, a3, knight b6, and the knight settles itself firmly at c4. Blissfully unconscious of the impending danger, Black goes about his business, which in this case consists of bringing the knight over to attack, and perhaps to occupy e4. Ordinarily, this is commendable procedure, but all strategy must be conditioned by the circumstances, the position at hand. All moves must be made with respect to the threats of the opponent, not to arbitrary judgments which declare that certain moves are always good or bad. All moves must be measured by their worth in the particular position being played. White has declared his intention of piling up as much pressure as possible on the c-file and on the c6 pawn. Black must meet that threat by bringing all his resources to bear for defense of the file, or institute a counterattack vigorous enough to divert White's forces from the assault. Black must do something to resolve his immediate difficulties, and he must do it at once, before his opponent gets a death grip on the open file. With his last move, Black misses a golden opportunity, his last chance to play c5, establish a state of tension in the center, and give his pieces more room to move around in. This fixes Black's c-pawn by preventing it from moving. If c5, then d takes c5, b takes c5, rook takes c5 and White wins a pawn. Rushing to the defense of the c-pawn and renewing, now that black realizes his peril, the possibility of pushing the pawn. Very fine strategy. White wants to remove black's bishop, since minor pieces are excellent defenders of pawns that are attacked by the heavy pieces. White's rooks could never seriously threaten the c-pawn while the bishop protected it. Was there anything else black could have done? If rook c7, white wins by bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, rook takes c6. Or if queen c7, then b4 further restrains the pawn, after which white intensifies the pressure by knight e5, simplifies by exchanging bishops and then takes the pawn off. The queen comes closer, attacking not only the a-pawn directly, but also the c-pawn indirectly by the threat queen b7, rook c7, rook takes c6, rook takes b7, rook takes d6, and white wins. Looks good, as black saves the a-pawn, keeps the queen out of b7, and prepares to double rooks and to supply the wretched pawn with another defender. White's strategy is simple, he piles up more pressure on the c-pawn. It is now attacked by 3 pieces and defended by 2. The planned rook f(c8) lets white win nicely by knight takes c6, rook takes c6, queen takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, queen f8, rook takes f8, king takes f8, rook c7, a5, rook b7, and the rest is child's play. From now on, white simply removes anything that isn't nailed down. Black is not wild about exchanging pieces when he is a pawn down, but what can he do? If he disputes the c-file by rook f(c8 then queen takes c8 wins, as in the earlier note, while on rook e7, rook c6, queen d8, a3 white's threat of winning the queen by rook c8, queen d6, rook 1 c6 is hard to meet. Or queen b4, knight d3, queen d2, rook 6 c2, queen a5, queen takes a5, b takes a5, and the forced exchange of queens leaves black's position in ruins. The rook recaptures, disdainful of the pinned pawn which is helpless to remove it, and remains in control of the valuable open file. This looks attractive as the knight attacks 2 pieces. If white replies knight takes d7, then queen takes d7 leaves a queen and rook ending which is not easy to win. White would eventually have to advance his pawn majority on the king side and expose his king to a possible drawing perpetual check. If the rook retreats, black continues knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5, again withdrawing chances. Neatly sidestepping the knight exchange, the rook gains time by attacking the queen. Black is forced into making this combination as the retreat by queen e7 is disastrous after rook c7, rook d8, queen b5, and white wins a piece. Simplify. That's the magic word to remember in endings where you have an advantage in material. With you are a pawn ahead, reduce the material, and your opponent's chances, by exchanging pieces, if it does not weaken your position. Forced, of course. A master move. You or I might grab the d-pawn in order to be 2 pawns ahead. This could win, but why complicate matters? Why let black seize the c-file with rook c8 and start a counterattack? Note that Pillsbury retains his attack on the d-pawn with the text move, adds to it a threat against the a-pawn and prevents black from playing rook c8, when the knight check at e7 would annihilate him. It is subtle moves in apparently simple positions and not queen sacrifices that mark the master player. Sooner or later, the king will need some air. The king is also anxious to lend a hand in the ending by moving toward the center, by way of g7. Another pawn falls, while two more are threatened by the rook. Unable to get to c8, the rook makes frantic efforts to enter the fight. The knight withdraws, still in position to punish rook c8 by knight e7 winning the rook. Black moves the king out of range of the knight check and closer to the center. There is no hurry about taking the d-pawn. White guards his a-pawn from any discovered attack on it by the rook hidden away at a8, and also prevents black's knight from later emerging at b4. Note that white avoids rook takes d5, rook c8, rook d6, the knight cannot move due to the mate threat, knight b4, when black wins the helpless knight. Finally posting his rook on the coveted file, but can black make use of it? White's king also needs an escape square. Black was threatening to win a piece by knight b8, twice attacking the knight which could not run away. The breakup of the pawn position around the castled king is of no consequence in the ending. It is in the opening and middle game that these moves endanger the health of the king, as then he may be assaulted by every piece on the board. Black protects his d-pawn, but at the cost of blocking the rook. There was little choice because white was threatening knight e7, rook c1, king g2, rook b1, rook takes b6, and the two connected passed pawns assure white an easy win. Once again chasing the rook from the open c-file. White threatens the rook, attacks the b-pawn and doubly attacks the d-pawn. Black must hang on to the b-pawn as long as possible, as with its loss white's pawns on the queen side are free to go on to queen. The pressure must not be relaxed. Pillsbury prefers this to the rook ending resulting from knight takes d5, knight takes d5, rook takes d5, though that would also win. The knight must leave, as the effort to protect it by rook b7 fails after knight takes d5 winning a piece. The d-pawn falls at last, giving white a passed pawn on the d-file and a rook on the 7th rank, in addition to the pawns he picked up. Rather than be gradually crushed to death, black gives up another pawn to get some sort of counterplay on the open file. If his rook can get behind white's pawns, it might gather up a couple of them. White can play safe and keep the rook out by knight c3, but capturing the b-pawn leaves him with 3 passed pawns, an offer hard to resist. Occupation of the 7th rank is the logical consequence of play on an open file by a rook. This could mean trouble for white except that he has powerful antidotes in all those pawns ready to rush up the board to become queens. The pawn lightly evades the rook's attack. White's pawns are not readily hindered from advancing, but perhaps white's deserted king might be sensitive to an attack by knight and rook. White goes calmly about his business of pushing the passed pawns and getting a queen. It was tempting to drive the knight off with f4, but this move, believe it or not, enables black to draw the game. After knight f3, king f1, rook d2, knight c4, knight takes h2, king g1, knight f3, king f1, knight h2, king e1, knight f3 black draws by perpetual check. Black tries another means of entry. Again, Pillsbury resists the impulse to get in a dig at the knight. If f3, then knight g5 again threatens knight takes f3 and a draw by perpetual check. Can black conjure up a mating attack? White demonstrates the futility of his opponent's gestures by paying no attention to them. The passed pawn has only 2 more squares to cover and cannot be stopped in its march. Black resigns.